Neither am I. I figured there was a group that was less likely to drive. Well, we went. It was small when we came in.
I won't come. I don't think I'll be here.
How much snow did you put on volunteer? All right. Really? It took $20.
It's supposed to snow all the way up to 7 o'clock tonight.
Not sure why.
I had more trouble with my mission like I had awful trouble with my car and everything.
I don't know. Do you want me to just use handhelds? It's my lapel pack. I'm not sure why.
I poured coffee all over the other day. We're going down to
You want me to turn it back on?
Slams on his brakes. I try to grab my cup.
Okay.
It was a brake check. It was a deer.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm just going to use mic 1 and mic 2.
Hello, hello, hello.
What? 1, 2.
Hello, hello. All right, there's one. Number 2. All right, fantastic. Thank you.
All right.
It is urgent, please talk to me about it after. In the meantime, we are going to get started on today's lesson. We are on part of the more well-known sections of Isaiah. So if you've been around the book of Isaiah for any length of time, you've probably heard about chapters 36 through 39. They get quoted a lot. It makes its way into sermons. The rest of Isaiah, not so much. You know, you get into a lot of the rest of Isaiah. Well, my favorite tunes. Thank you. You get into the rest of Isaiah, and a lot of that is not very easy to preach on just a regular Sunday morning unless you're intentionally going verse by verse. So this is part of the section that becomes a lot easier for people to get through. So last time we had finished on a lesson or a point called Victory, Proclamation, and Pilgrimage. So we actually are continuing that point today. In Mattier's view, chapters 33 through 35 come together as the final woe of the 6 woes we talked about last time. So this is all part of that final woe, in his opinion. Last week we finished discussing the proclamation here, and so this week we start with the second proclamation, come near. So we did hear, now it's come near. However, on top of that, we will also be talking about a generalization of judgment, and we're going to shift from generalizations to particulars, like God saving Jerusalem from Sennacherib, which we've been talking about for weeks, how that was going to happen, that the people were going to get to the throat of Jerusalem and then be stopped. And then we're also going to talk about Hezekiah's life extending. So that'll be today's lesson plan. We'll go through that and get moving. So the first thing we're going to look at is universal judgment. Come near. This is for chapter 34, verses 1 through 17. Like I said, this message comes on the heels of last week's message as a second proclamation. If you remember, last week we finished in chapter 33, and it was a good message. It was a message of them hearing the call of this coming king, this king of Zion that was going to make things right. Well, now he's saying, come near and see what happens when this king of Zion comes, okay? Isaiah 34, verse 1, it says, come near, ye nations, to hear and hearken, ye people. Let the earth hear and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth of it. So he says, come, hear the message, everybody. Again, it's generalized, all people. Verse 2, you see the promise of judgment. This is actually going to be God's final judgment on the world. That's what's described in chapter 34. Isaiah 34:2 says, for the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all of their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them, and hath delivered them to the slaughter. If you are familiar with this passage, he says it's to all nations, he says it's to all armies, he's coming against them in judgment. But what you'd find really interesting, if you continue your way down through chapter 34, is then he seems to specify Idumea. Does anyone remember who Idumea is? What group that's talking about? Okay, the group of Idumea is talking about Edom. It's talking about Esau's lineage. It's talking about those that would come down from his line. So Idumea, which is Edom, becomes the picture of those that oppose God's plan. Whether you realized it or not, from Genesis all the way till right now, you've kind of had Esau and his people kind of sticking what looks like a thorn in the eye of God's chosen people. So in the very beginning, you have Jacob and Esau, and they don't get along right because, Jacob is deceitful, and Esau is this really good hunter, but he ends up hating his brother. He ends up coming against him, having great anger to the point where Esau comes to Jacob and says, when Dad dies, I'm going to kill you. And so it's very, very crazy, just the level that this gets to. And again, it started over Jacob's misdeeds. I don't want to hinder anyone's thinking on that. It was not Jacob being good and Esau being bad. But we'll read the verse there first, maybe Isaiah 34, 5 through 6. He says, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea." So again, he's talking about the people of Edom, kind of. It's actually still about all nations. Because remember, that's how he starts it out in verse 1 and 2. He says, "Come near, all you nations, hear, God's wrath, his indignation is against all nations." And like I said, Edom becomes the picture of those that oppose God's plans. This is seen as well in the way that the Edomites treated the Israelites as they were going out after the Exodus. You first get an introduction to them in the book of Numbers, and they say, "Hey, you're our brother. We'd like to come through. We're not going to take any of your stuff. We just want to get to the land that God has promised us." And Edom basically said, "Go fall in a hole." They said, "There's no way. We're not letting you through. It's not going to happen." And it just showed the level of animosity between the two had not gone down. It had consisted even though Israel had been gone for 400 years in Egypt. The relationship with Edom was actually so bad that by the time David gets into power, he had to go and conquer Edom and annex it for a time. They were under his power for a while. Now, they rebelled under King Solomon. Solomon was not able to keep them after Solomon sinned. He started having all kinds of issues. One of them was the rebelling of the Edomite people coming out from underneath them. And if you were to read the book of Obadiah, you would see that even potentially at the destruction of Jerusalem 100 years after this event, Edom is either participating or cheering on the wickedness that happens at Jerusalem. So Edom and Israel are the opposite ends of the coin. This is the one that is for God, this is the one that is for man's way. And it's pictured that way sometimes in the New Testament as well. You have God picking Jacob instead of Esau. You have God's way, you have the natural way. Now, another interesting note with this is Edom is sometimes used to represent all of mankind. And the reason for this, when you see Idumea, when you see Edom, and even when you see the word Adam, what you'll find out is they have the same consonants in all three spellings. And in ancient Hebrew, they didn't always put the vowels in. So they'd have no vowels, so all you'd see is what represents their D and what represents their M. So Edom became a very easy picture for Adam or man, because that's what Adam means. And so Edom, a lot of times, plays that role of being a picturesque view of what God will do to mankind. We see that here as he's talking to Edom, or Idumea at this point, but he's doing it through all nations. So the destruction that is to come, if you're familiar with the book of Revelation, is not just small scale, right? It's total. It is an utter destruction across the earth. This is not something that anyone's going to be able to get out of. It doesn't matter how much money you make or how much you have. You can't pay your way out of this. Praise the Lord, God can't be bribed. But it goes through that in verses 10 through 12. 12 saying specifically, "They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be as nothing." Now, as they go through this time of destruction, this time of judgment, we'll find that all of God's promises of these things will be established. He actually ends this chapter saying, if you want to be sure, go back and look in the book. I said it, it's going to happen. Which is a pretty incredible thing to say. That's what he says in verses 16 to 17. We're going to paraphrase that way and keep on going. So we see the universal judgment that God calls for. Then we see in chapter 35 the pilgrimage of the redeemed. When the king comes in verse 33, obviously there's this renewed state where you have the Spirit and the king working together. In chapter 34, God has a judgment across all the earth, but then chapter 35, you get to what seems like a redeemed earth of sorts. Isaiah 35, 1 and 2. It says, "The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice. The blossom as the rose, and they shall blossom abundantly, and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall be the glory of the Lord. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God." You see in this picture, you see the places that used to be destitute, used to have nothing in them, used to have no life, transformed from barren and bleak to teeming and budding with life. The creation then will be rejoicing as opposed to the groaning it's currently doing. If you were to look, say, in Romans 8, it talks about how all creation groans with things that can't be uttered because of the weightiness of sin on the earth. So this explosion of life also comes from the proximity it has toward its maker. It says all these things happen because they shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God. It says that the glory and excellency of God would be there, and that's what brings this abundant life. Go figure, the King of life brings life when he comes. Now, it's no wonder then that Jesus is sometimes referenced as things like the Rose of Sharon. It's no wonder then that Jesus is referenced as the glory of the Lord. And what we see when Jesus came into the world in a figurative sense, in that he brought life to places where life was not, we will one day see in a literal sense when he brings his ultimate kingdom here. So we see then not only the redeemed earth, but we see comfort for the downtrodden. Isaiah 35, 3 through 6. It says, "Strengthen ye the weak hands, and confirm the feeble knees. Say to them that are of a fearful heart, Be strong, and fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with a recompense, and he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, and the lame man shall leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing." It's interesting to note that this is the same listing, basically, of things that Jesus used to prove who he was when John the Baptist asks. John the Baptist sends people to Jesus, says, "Hey, are you the Messiah we're looking for, or do we look for another?" And Jesus basically goes through something similar to this list and say, "Hey, tell him that, the blind see, the deaf can hear, the dead are raised, the poor have the gospel preached to them, and be not faithless but believing," basically. And he goes through and he tells him all the things you'd expect to see when the world is redeemed, you can see on the front end right now while its maker is here in the flesh. The other sections of that he talks about being there, like the poor have the gospel preached unto them, we'll get to when we hit Isaiah 61, by the way. That comes up later. This verse is also seemingly referenced in Paul in his preaching in 1 Thessalonians 5:14, where he basically says, strengthen the weak hands, comfort the feeble knees, comfort those that need it. And he uses some of these same terminology as is talked about in Isaiah 35. Now, the general idea is that the final redemption of God's people, those who have had a rough go of it, will have words of comfort given to them, which is really good. And that's why even if you think about like the Sermon on the Mount, what does he say? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are they that have mourned. Blessed are, and he goes through all the people who really have got what seems to be the short end of the stick the whole way through. And he says, blessed are you, because the message of comfort has come. Ultimately, those are the people more likely to be ready to hear and accept the message, right? And when you look at those in, say, Matthew chapter 5, a lot of those things actually have to do with those in a spiritual realm. The poor in spirit, those kind of things. But ultimately what you see is those are the ones that were ready to hear God's help. Those are the ones that were ready for a word of comfort to come. And ultimately, we know in the end times, there will be a time of true comfort to those that are God's. The renewal of life depicted as water in Isaiah 35, 6 through 7. So it talked about the life at the beginning. You get that pictured out in water in Isaiah 35, 6, the latter half of 6 and 7. It says, "For in the wilderness waters break out, and the streams in the desert. The parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water, and the habitation of dragons where each lay shall be grass with reeds and rushes." You see, the picture of water breaking out in the wilderness is a common trope of the life-giving flow that Christ gives. Ezekiel talks about a water stream that runs from the temple all the way out and fills the world. You have this picture used to talk about the life-giving mode. And we can understand that. I mean, if there's a few things you had to have on a deserted island, I'm betting water, fresh water, makes your list. Now, the idea almost brings back this picture of this Edenic feel. What happened in the Garden of Eden is we had paradise lost, and what's promised at the end times is paradise remade, basically. You get the Edenic connection with God. You get this, we get to be close and interact with Him, but we also get the lush life that comes with things that are around God's presence. And then in verses 8 through 10, we see that there is peace, joy, and holiness for the people of God as they go on their way back to Zion. Isaiah 35, 8 through 10, it says, "And an highway shall be there, and a way it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools shall not err therein. No lion shall be there, nor ravenous beast shall go up thereupon. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away." Now, whether this highway back to Zion, although it probably is talking about at the end of times when there is a full bringing back of the people to Israel, also we see it in the meantime having a spiritual fulfillment in Christians through Christ. We have this way that we've gone through. He is the way of holiness. We have this peace that we can have where we have no fear over anything because we are more than conquerors, and we have this joy that comes through Christ. We follow that holiness, that way of holiness as the redeemed, and it comes with everlasting joy and peace along the way. So again, these are more pictures of the end times, but when Jesus came, Jesus became the initiator of those things. What Jesus did when He came is He said, hey, the life that I've promised you will come, here's the beginning of that. Here's what that looks like. Here's what it'll be. And you see the ultimate fulfillment of it when He brings back all of Israel like He said He would. But you get the initiation of the kingdom, the inauguration of the kingdom, which will then be carried out later. So then we see not only these general principles, these general statements made about the whole world, about judgment, and then about the redeemed, we see as well the rock of history. Now, it's called that because when you look at, say, the Psalms, you look to Christ, you look to God and say, He is the rock that does not move. He is the rock that is higher than I. He's the one who helps me be sturdy in an unsafe place. And if you look at what happens in chapters 36 and 37, the people of Jerusalem are in a very big predicament. They are not in a safe place. What you have going on, you've got a couple embassies that are sent, and then you've got the final destruction of the Assyrians. The initial dating to the first embassy being sent is probably around 703 or maybe 702. This first embassy was when Hezekiah was wanting to fix things, mostly according with man's wisdom. He's doing things his own way, and you can see that by the things that Rabshakeh says to him, which we'll see here in a minute. Isaiah 36, 1 and 2 says, "Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defense cities of Judah, and he took them. And the king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh from Lachish to Jerusalem unto King Hezekiah with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field." Just by way of note, it is interesting, this place is referenced potentially 3 times in the book of Isaiah, this place in particular. The first one in Isaiah 7:3, when Isaiah comes and says, ask a sign of God and he'll give you one, and then he promises this son that would be born, this virgin would conceive. And then in chapter 22, you get this picture with Eliakim when he comes onto the scene, which, remember when we talked about the Isaiah 7 prophecy, some think it is Eliakim he's talking about in the immediate sense, with the greater sense being Jesus. And then here in Isaiah 36:3, Eliakim is present again. It's in this same place that keeps getting brought up. As we continue on, though, he gives some really interesting information to us. During this first embassy call, Jerusalem has been talking about alliances with Egypt, which we've talked about in the previous weeks. That was the problem. They were trusting in Egypt, not trusting in God. And this is the first thing that he calls them out on. Rabshakeh does. It says, "Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So this Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all that trust in him. But if thou wilt say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and said unto Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar?" You see, up until this point, Hezekiah, although he ends up being a good king overall, doesn't seem to where he has put trust in God as much as he ought to. He's sought these political alliances. He's sought these other ways of trying to go about these things. And Rabshakeh, being a pagan on the other side of it, says, don't think that your God's going to help you out of it either. And he makes the note in several places, you think your God's going to do something. What about the gods of all these other places we've already defeated, including but not limited to the 10 northern tribes of Israel? Why didn't your God help them then? And so you get kind of this concept where he's saying nothing will stop us. You will be defeated. He even goes as far as saying, even if you gave us a pledge of money for chariots, you wouldn't even have enough people to put on them to fight us. There is no way you're going to survive this. And so he goes from having this argument that he's having and taking shots at the leadership to noting that these strategies will be ineffective, and then he changes his direction and makes remarks towards the people in general in hopes of swaying their hearts away from the king and the king's words. Isaiah 36, 11 and 13, "And then Eliakim and Shebna and Joah said unto Rabshakeh, Speak, I pray thee, to thy servants in the Syrian language, for we understand it, and speak not to us in the Jews' language, in the ears of the people on the wall." Now, Rabshakeh, being a pagan, uses some very colorful language on the back end of this, saying, why not speak to them? That's who needs to know. They're going to basically be drinking their own urine and eating their own excrement. These are the people that are going to be stuck as we lock you guys in. You have nowhere to go, and you're starving to death. And so he speaks out to the people instead and does it right in the face of those other leaders he just asked him not to. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in the Jews' language and said, Hear ye the words of the great king of Assyria. And And so you see that. He's trying to sway the people. He's trying to get in their head, just like he's trying to get in the head of the leaders. Hezekiah, upon being told of all these things, he was told what was said, encouraged his leadership team to pray to God, although he personally was not yet present in this prayer. Isaiah 37:4. It may be that the Lord will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria his master hath sent, that reproaches the living God, and will reprove the words which the Lord thy God hath heard. Wherefore lift up thy prayer for the remnant that is left. Now when they pray, God does respond. He responds to the prayer of Hezekiah's leaders. He intends to destroy them. He says he's going to do it with a rumor, a blast, and then his ultimate doom will be in his own land. Because we've just basically paraphrased that, I'm going to skip the next verse, but that's what he essentially responds to their prayer with, and he does it through Isaiah. So seemingly what happens between here and verses 8 through 10 is God sends message back through Isaiah to the people, and the king sends message to Rabshakeh that, no, we're going to trust in God. We're going to trust God to get us out of this. And so we see this second Assyrian embassy take place. This seems to be after this initial response to Rabshakeh. Isaiah 37, 8 through 10, Rabshakeh returned away for the moment, found the king of Assyria warring against Libnah, for he had heard that he had departed from Lachish, and he heard of saying that Tir-Haka, the king of Ethiopia, is come forth to war with thee. So there you go. There's the rumor God promised he's going to use. He said, I'm going to send a rumor that's going to get him somewhere else. And he does. He sends a rumor. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, saying, Let not thy God, in whom thou trustest, deceive thee, saying, Jerusalem shall not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. So again, he's still talking trash to Hezekiah and about God. Hezekiah then makes a personal prayer before the Lord in verses 14 through 20. It's a good prayer. It'd be worth your time to go through, but we don't have time to do so now. And Hezekiah's prayer, God responds. God gives a message to Assyria about them not realizing who they are dealing with. Verse 23 and 24, he said, Whom hast thou reproached and blasphemed? And against whom hast thou exalted thy voice and lifted up thine eyes on high? Even against the Holy One of Israel. By thy servants thou hast reproached the Lord, and hast said, By the multitude of my chariots am I come up to the heights of the mountains, to the sides of Lebanon, and I will cut down the tall cedars thereof, and the choice fir trees thereof, and I will enter into the heights of the border of the forest of this Carmel. But I know thy abode, and thy going out, and thy coming in, and thy rage against me. Because thy rage is against me, and thy tumult is come up to mine ears, therefore will I put my hook in thy nose, and my bridle in thy lips, and I will turn thee back the way which thou camest. Now when he does this, he brings comfort to Israel, to Judah specifically, saying, He will not even shoot an arrow into your city. You will be fine. Now, we see then the finale, the Assyrian overthrow. It takes place very quickly in just a few verses. The angel of the Lord went forth and smote the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. 185,000 people. The angel of the Lord comes out, just wipes them out. Now, seemingly, this was not the whole of the army, because at the very least, the king makes it back home alive. So there may have been others who went back with him. But you know what it did do, is it made him realize, maybe I ought to back off this. And you don't see Assyria coming into the land anymore after this point. When they arose early in the morning, they found all dead corpses. It says, So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, went and returned, and dwelt at Nineveh. That is the main capital city. He said, Well, I'm going home. I imagine that he said, like John MacArthur did when John MacArthur felt called to preach, he said, God, if this is how you fight, I quit. If you're not familiar, John MacArthur was thrown through a window in a bad car crash and was brought out of it, but for him, You see, this angel of the Lord, though, is probably not some random angel. God said that he would himself come against them. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is often pictured as one who is God, but somehow is also distinct from God, bringing the message of God, which is the early incarnate picture of Jesus Christ in a lot of ways. Now, it's not to say every time you see the angel of the Lord, you can say it's Jesus, but there are times where it's very easy to tell. Like in the burning bush, most of us would say that's Yahweh, but if you read the passage, it says it's the angel of the Lord. If you were to take, say, who appeared unto Gideon, you have someone who gives the message from God, but who also is God. And so you've got some of this duality there that seems to be there that you're trying to figure out through the Old Testament. As we continue to look here, it says that as he was worshiping in the house of his God, his two sons smote him and killed him and escaped into the land of Armenia, and his son Esarhaddon ruled in his stead. Now this actually doesn't happen for many years. Sennacherib's defeat happens in 701. He doesn't get murdered at home until 681. I wrote 581. It's 681. So he's gone home. He's given up trying to fight Jerusalem. That's over. And then as we continue for the last portion of this, we will look at Hezekiah's fatal choice. Now this just got summarized, but Hezekiah's prior tiff with Sennacherib, or prior to his tiff with Sennacherib, he had been gravely ill. It's placed after in the book of Isaiah, but this actually likely would have happened before, just so you guys know that. Isaiah tells the king, get your house in order because you're going to die. Hezekiah then prays to God, begging him to be allowed to live, and God then allows him to live longer. He grants him 15 more years. Interestingly enough, he gives him something to do to be a part of that. When God says he's going to do something, he doesn't always just do it on his own. He oftentimes gives his servants a part to play. And so his part to play is he had to go get these specific fig leaves and touch them on this boil that had him sick, and he improved and got better. Now, God confirms the promise to him by moving the sun's shadow back 10 degrees on a sundial, which is sick. I don't know how he did that. God's awesome, and he made it. He can do whatever he wants. But now, although this sounds really promising, Hezekiah's request ends up being the bane of the country's existence. During his last 15 years of life, he has a son named Manasseh. Manasseh is only 12 years old when he begins reigning, which means his extension of life encouraged him to have this child who ends up being the most wicked ruler that Judah ever saw. On top of that, during this time when he gets healed up, Babylon sends him some ambassadors to check in on him. And he thinks the best thing I can do in this scenario is take them through all my kingdom and show all the ways God has blessed me. Which then God tells him, hey, what'd you do? And he tells God what he did, and he said, great, they're coming back. They're going to take all your stuff. Good plan. And he's the reason that Babylon comes 100 years later, 120 years later, 100 years later, and sacks Jerusalem. He showed them all the wonderful treasures that he had, and they said, great, we're coming back for this. You know, I've heard it said, either you die in time to be a hero or you live long enough to become a villain. I don't know if that's always true, but it seemed like it was in Hezekiah's case. It may be that God just once again is reminding us that he has an ultimate plan for blessing and for judgment. And it happens on behalf of faith in him and not anyone else, even a king who was in charge during this great upset during the Assyrians. And I think that's the reason he puts it after, is he's trying to show you he's ultimately going to be responsible for the ruin of this country too. Don't get such a big head about who he is right now. So that's the picture of what's gone on in Isaiah. You've got all the way to the point where we switch themes, and it's going to get much more happy as you get through 40 through 66. We go into the time of consolation. In the meantime, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the ways that you've shown us how important it is to come to you in faith, to not trust in other things, other people, but to lean on you. And God, I was so encouraged this past week when I heard a pastor say, there's no great men of God. There's just sinful men that God uses. And we are sinful men that you have opted to use. We are means for your plan. And God, I pray that you'd use us to see great things accomplished for you, for your glory. In Christ's name.